The true untold story of Frederick Douglass, the man who defied America and paid the price. It was 1824. A 6-year-old child woke before dawn on the cold floor of a slave cabin in Maryland. His name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, a name he would change years later to erase the past. But there was a secret this child carried, a secret whispered among the enslaved, never spoken aloud. He was the son of a white man, not just any white man. Probably the plantation owner himself, the man who owned his mother. The man who by law also owned him. This brutal truth, born from institutionalized sexual violence, would define Frederick Douglass's life in ways even he couldn't predict. Because being the son of a slave master and an enslaved woman brought him no privilege. On the contrary, it made him a living threat, a walking testimony to the moral hypocrisy that sustained the entire American slave system. In the twisted logic of slavery, mixed-race children were simultaneously proof of white men's power and their moral bankruptcy. They were the evidence that could not be spoken of, the shame that had to be hidden in plain sight. The human beings whose very existence accused their fathers of the most profound violations. This is the real story of a man who shouldn't have survived, who shouldn't have learned to read, who shouldn't have escaped, who shouldn't have become one of the most powerful voices of the 19th century. But he survived, and he changed America forever, even though America never completely changed for him. His life would become a testament to human resilience, intellectual brilliance, and the indomitable spirit that refuses to accept change, whether physical or mental. Frederick Douglass never knew his father, but he knew who he was. Everyone knew. The silence surrounding his paternity was deafening, a collective agreement never to speak the obvious truth. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was a slave who worked on neighboring farms, and he saw her only a few times a year. She walked miles at night after a full day of forced labor, just to be beside him for a few hours before having to return before dawn. If she didn't return in time, she would be whipped. These nighttime visits were acts of desperate maternal love, defying exhaustion and the threat of violence just to hold her son for a few precious moments. Douglass wrote in his memoirs that he had no clear affectionate memories of his mother. She died when he was about 7 years old, and he learned of her death as if she were a stranger. Because slavery didn't just steal bodies, it stole families, memories, basic human bonds. The system was designed to prevent love, to sever connections, to ensure that enslaved people could never form the kinds of relationships that might give them the strength to resist. A mother who couldn't raise her child, a child who couldn't know his father, families torn apart and scattered like seeds in the wind. This was slavery's everyday cruelty. But the question of paternity was even darker. Douglass wrote bitterly about the common practice of white masters raping enslaved women and then enslaving their own children. It was a system that fed on its own cruelty, a perpetual motion machine of exploitation and abuse. Mixed-race children like Douglass often aroused the hatred of the master's wife and other white family members. After all, they were living proof of adultery and immorality. These children became targets of a double hatred resented by white women for being evidence of their husband's infidelity and despised by white men for being reminders of their own moral failures. In his book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, published in 1845, he exposed this reality without euphemism. Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. In addition to the burdens common to both, there are wrongs peculiar to women. He understood that enslaved women faced a unique horror. Not only the violence of forced labor, but the constant threat of sexual assault, the agony of bearing children who would be enslaved, the impossibility of protecting their daughters from the same fate they had endured. Douglass also observed the cruel paradox. Children of masters with slaves frequently suffered more brutal treatment than other enslaved people, because their very existence was a silent accusation against the system, and because deep down they were seen as more dangerous. They had white blood, and that in the racist mind of the era meant intelligence and ambition that could lead to rebellion. The logic was twisted but consistent. If white blood conferred superiority, then mixed-race children might possess enough of that superiority to become threats. Better to crush them early, to break their spirits before they could realize their potential. Frederick was separated from his mother as an infant, a deliberate practice to break any emotional bond between mother and child. Slave owners had learned that the strongest resistance came from people who had something to fight for, someone to protect. By destroying family bonds from birth, they hoped to create human beings who had nothing, who belonged to no one, who existed only as property. He was raised by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, in a small cabin distant from the big house. There he lived in relative freedom until age 6. He played barefoot, shirtless, with other enslaved children, not yet understanding the full weight of the chains that awaited him. But everything changed in 1824. He was taken from his grandmother's cabin, torn away without warning or explanation, and delivered to the Y Plantation, property of Colonel Edward Lloyd, one of the wealthiest men in Maryland. It was there that Frederick first saw the true face of slavery. He saw men and women being whipped until their flesh opened. He saw children arrancadas from their mother's arms. He saw hunger, exhaustion, despair. The plantation was a small kingdom of terror where Lloyd ruled with absolute power over hundreds of human beings who had no rights, no protection, no hope of justice. One image remained forever etched in his memory: Aunt Hester being tied by her hands to a hook in the ceiling and brutally whipped by Aaron Anthony, the overseer. Her crime was unclear. Perhaps she had visited a man Anthony disapproved of. Perhaps she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The reasons didn't matter. What mattered was the demonstration of power, the public spectacle of violence that reminded every enslaved person what awaited them if they stepped out of line. Douglass, hidden in a closet, witnessed everything. He was only 6 or 7 years old, and the screams, the blood, the rhythmic crack of the whip against flesh. These became his introduction to the world he inhabited. Years later he would write, "It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It struck me with awful force. It was a most terrible spectacle, but there was also something that set him apart from the very beginning. Voracious curiosity. Frederick observed everything. He paid attention to the conversations of white people. He memorized faces, names, places. He wanted to understand the world around him, and that was dangerous for an enslaved boy. Curiosity was seen as insolence. Questions were interpreted as challenges to authority. Intelligence in a slave was not a gift to be cultivated, but a threat to be suppressed. Yet Frederick couldn't help himself. His mind was too active, too hungry for knowledge, too unwilling to accept the boundaries that slavery tried to impose. At age 8, Frederick was sent to Baltimore to serve in the house of Hugh Old and his wife Sophia. This change saved his life. Years later, Douglass would recognize this transfer as providential, the first stroke of fortune in a life that had known little of it. Baltimore was a different world from the plantation. A bustling port city where enslaved and free blacks lived side by side, where the cruelties of slavery were somewhat softened by urban proximity and the watchful eyes of neighbors. Sophia Old was different from other whites he had known. She had never owned slaves before and initially treated Frederick with something close to kindness. She was a religious woman from a poor white family. Unused to the casual cruelty that slaveholding required, she saw Frederick not as property, but as a human child, and this simple recognition would change everything. And she did something that would alter the entire trajectory of his life. She began teaching him to read. She showed him letters, helped him spell simple words. Frederick absorbed everything like a sponge, his quick mind seizing on this new knowledge with fierce determination. For the first time, the symbols on pages began to make sense. Words revealed themselves as containers of meaning, of ideas, of power. But when Hugh All discovered what his wife was doing, he was furious. In a revealing outburst that Frederick overheard, he told his wife, "If you teach that him to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to us. Learning would spoil the best breath in the world. If you teach him how to read, he'll want to know how to write, and this accomplished, he'll be running away with himself." Douglass, hidden nearby, heard everything, and in that moment he had an epiphany that he would describe as the most important moment of his life. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty to wit the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I praised it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Hugh Old had accidentally revealed the secret that slaveholders guarded most carefully. Education was the antidote to slavery. Knowledge was power. Literacy was liberation. If reading would unfit him to be a slave, then reading was exactly what he needed to pursue with every fiber of his being. If education was the key that slave masters guarded so carefully, then he would steal it, and that's exactly what he did. From that moment forward, every opportunity to learn became a covert act of rebellion. Douglass began trading pieces of bread with poor white boys on the streets of Baltimore in exchange for reading lessons. These boys were hungry for food. He was hungry for knowledge. They taught him letters and words in exchange for the bread he managed to save from his own meager rations. He stole old newspapers from trash heaps and read them in secret. He copied letters from fences and signs, tracing them with his finger in the dirt. He studied in secret, always afraid of being discovered, always aware that what he was doing was considered dangerous and subversive. At 12 years old, he managed to secretly buy a book with 50 cents he had saved, a collection called the Columbian Orator. This book became his Bible, his window into a world of ideas that slavery had tried to keep hidden from him. It contained speeches about liberty, democracy, human rights, the natural equality of all people. It included a dialogue between a master and a slave in which the slave systematically dismantled every argument for slavery. And the master, unable to refute his logic, freed him. That book became his Bible. He memorized entire passages. He learned rhetoric, argumentation, eloquence. He discovered that words could be weapons more powerful than any physical force, that ideas could break chains that iron could not. And most importantly, he learned that slavery was a moral monstrosity that could be fought with words. The book gave him a vocabulary for the injustice he experienced daily, a framework for understanding that what he suffered was not natural or inevitable, but a choice that human beings made and could unmake. Every page confirmed what he had begun to suspect, that he was not inferior, that his bondage was not justified, that the system that held him was built on lies. At 15, Frederick was returned to the countryside. His behavior in Baltimore had become problematic for the olds. He was too confident, too well-spoken, too aware of his own worth. He asked questions. He looked white people in the eye. He carried himself with a dignity that was considered inappropriate for a slave. So they sent him back to the rural eastern shore of Maryland, hoping that hard field labor would break the spirit that education had awakened. He was sent to work under several different masters, experiencing again the brutality of plantation life that he had briefly escaped. But in 1834, at 16 years old, he was hired out to Edward C.V., a man with a sinister reputation throughout the county. C.V. was known as a slave breaker. Wealthy farmers who had enslaved people considered too rebellious, too proud, too resistant would rent them to C.V. for a year. His job was to destroy their will, to transform them into docile, obedient workers, and he was terrifyingly good at what he did. Cobb's method was simple and brutal: constant physical violence, exhausting work without rest, systematic psychological humiliation designed to destroy any sense of self-worth. He wanted to break not just the body, but the spirit, to reduce human beings to beasts of burden who would never again dare to assert their humanity. He worked his slaves from before dawn until after dark, allowing them barely enough time to eat and sleep. He appeared suddenly from behind trees and buildings, trying to catch them resting for even a moment so he could beat them for laziness. He created an atmosphere of constant fear and surveillance. During the first 6 months under C.V., Frederick was whipped almost every day, sometimes with a whip, other times with oak sticks, sometimes with whatever implement was at hand. C.V.Y. beat him for any reason: for working too slowly, for working too quickly, for looking at him wrong, for not looking at him at all, or for no reason at all, simply to remind him of his powerlessness. Frederick bled, could barely walk, lost weight rapidly as the meager rations couldn't sustain the punishing labor. His hands became covered with blisters that broke and bled. His back was a map of scars. He would describe this period as the darkest of his life, when he almost completely lost hope, when he seriously considered suicide as preferable to continued suffering. On one occasion, C.V. beat him so hard that Frederick fainted from exhaustion and pain, collapsing in the field under the scorching sun. When he woke up, he tried to return to work, but collapsed again, his body simply unable to continue. C.V. found him lying in the field and kicked him violently in the side of the head, opening a wound that bled profusely. In that moment, something inside Frederick broke. Not his resistance, but his fear. He realized that he could endure no more, that continuing to submit meant death anyway, and that he might as well die fighting than live on his knees. He made a desperate decision. He ran away from Cuvey's farm and walked 7 miles through the woods to the plantation where his legal master, Thomas Old, lived. He hoped that Old, seeing his condition, his head bleeding, his body covered in wounds, would take him back or hire him out to someone else, but Old was unmoved. He told Frederick that he deserved the treatment he was getting, that K.V.Y. was doing him a favor by teaching him proper behavior, and that he must return immediately or face even worse consequences. On an August morning in 1834, shortly after his return, Defy tried to tie him up for another whipping. He approached with rope, intending to bind Frederick's hand so he couldn't resist. But this time, Frederick fought back. He grabbed Defy by the throat. The overseer's eyes widened in shock. No slave had ever dared to touch him in resistance, and they fought. For nearly 2 hours, the 16-year-old fought hand-to-hand with the adult man who had terrorized him for months. They grappled in the barn, wrestling like ancient combatants, neither willing to yield. Covey called for help. Other white men appeared. A cousin and 2 enslaved men Covey ordered to assist him. But the cousin refused to get involved, perhaps afraid of Frederick's desperate strength. And the enslaved men, when ordered to help tie Frederick, moved slowly and ineffectively, clearly hoping he would win. For 2 hours, Frederick held his ground, fighting with every ounce of strength he possessed. Frederick won, not in the sense that he beat Defy into submission, but in the sense that Defy finally gave up and walked away. The slave breaker had been unable to break this particular slave. Defy, humiliated by his inability to subdue a teenage boy, never touched Frederick again for the remaining 6 months of his hire. Perhaps he feared another fight. Perhaps he feared that word would spread and ruin his reputation. Or perhaps, for the first time, he recognized something in Frederick's eyes that he couldn't break, and Frederick would never be the same. He wrote later, "It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long-crushed spirit rose. Cowardice departed. Bold defiance took its place. I felt as I never felt before. It was a turning point in my career as a slave. I had reached the point where I was not afraid to die. This spirit made me a freeman, in fact, while I remained a slave in form. The physical chains remained, but something inside him had been liberated. He had discovered that he could fight back, that he didn't have to accept every degradation, that his manhood could not be taken from him without his consent. During the following years, Frederick worked under less brutal masters, but the seed of freedom had already germinated and taken deep root in his soul. He began planning an escape, thinking through every detail, considering every risk. In 1836, with a group of other enslaved men who shared his desperate desire for freedom, he organized an escape attempt. The plan was to steal a boat and row up the Chesapeake Bay toward Pennsylvania and freedom, but they were betrayed. Someone informed on them, whether out of fear, jealousy, or hope of reward, Frederick never knew. They were captured before they could even begin their journey. A mob of white men descended on them with ropes and guns. Frederick was seized, bound, and nearly lynched by an enraged crowd who saw his education and eloquence as particularly dangerous. They screamed that he should be hanged as an example, that educated slaves were worse than murderers. He was imprisoned, spending time in a jail cell, expecting at any moment to be sold to the brutal plantations of the Deep South, a fate considered a death sentence, where enslaved people were literally worked to death in cotton and sugar fields. But Thomas Alva, for reasons Frederick never fully understood, perhaps concerned about the loss of valuable property, perhaps influenced by some small remaining human feeling, decided not to sell him south. Instead, he sent him back to Baltimore, where Frederick returned to work as a caulker in the shipyards, learning a skilled trade that would prove crucial to his eventual escape. In Baltimore's shipyards, he worked alongside both enslaved and free black men, and the contrast between their conditions constantly reminded him of what he was fighting for. There, working in the shipyards, he met Anna Murray, a free black woman who worked as a domestic servant. Anna was remarkable in her own right. Strong-willed, independent, and brave enough to help an enslaved man escape despite the enormous risks to herself. She was literate and had saved money from her years of work. She became Frederick's partner in planning his escape, providing not just emotional support, but practical assistance that would prove essential. They fell in love, and she became determined to help him reach freedom so they could build a life together. On September 3, 1838, Frederick executed the boldest and most dangerous plan of his life. He borrowed identification papers from a free black sailor he knew, a man who was willing to risk severe legal penalties to help him. Douglass, dressed as a sailor, wearing a red shirt, a tarpaulin hat, and a black cravat tied in a sailor's knot. The borrowed free papers identified him as a free American sailor, but they would not stand up to close scrutiny. The physical description didn't match him exactly. With his heart pounding and fear coursing through every nerve, he boarded a train at Baltimore headed north toward Wilmington. This was the most dangerous moment. Conductors routinely checked the papers of black passengers, and slave catchers actively patrolled the trains looking for runaways. At each stop, the fear of being discovered was suffocating. Any passenger could denounce him. Any policeman could demand to see his documents up close. One close look at the papers would reveal the deception. One person who recognized him would mean capture, punishment, possibly death. When the conductor came through checking tickets and papers, Frederick handed over his documents with hands that he forced to remain steady. The conductor glanced at them briefly, too briefly to notice the discrepancies, and moved on. Frederick could barely breathe. At one stop, he saw a man who knew him, a ship captain who could identify him as a slave. The man looked directly at him, and Frederick was certain he was caught. But somehow, miraculously, the man didn't recognize him or chose not to speak. At another point, a free black man who knew Frederick boarded the train, and again, Frederick expected exposure. But the man, understanding what was happening, said nothing. The train reached Wilmington. From there, Frederick took a steamboat up the Delaware River to Philadelphia. Every mile felt like an eternity. Every moment brought the possibility of discovery, but he arrived in Philadelphia. And from there he traveled to New York. When he finally stepped onto free soil, when he realized he had actually succeeded, that he was no longer someone's property, he fell to his knees and wept. The relief was overwhelming, almost unbearable. Years later, he described that moment. A new world had opened upon me. If life is more than breath and the quick round of blood, I lived more in one day than in a year of my slave life. It was a time of joyous excitement, which words can but tamely describe, but freedom came with immediate challenges. New York in 1838 was not safe for fugitive slaves. Slave catchers prowled the streets, and the fugitive slave law meant that Frederick could be captured and returned to Maryland at any moment. He was alone in a strange city without money, without connections, uncertain whom he could trust. He sought help from the black community and was directed to David Ruggles, an activist who helped fugitive slaves. Anna Murray soon joined him, bringing money she had saved and possessions she had sold to finance their future together. On September 15, 1838, just 12 days after his escape, they were married by James W.C. Pennington, himself, a fugitive slave who had become a minister. From New York, they traveled to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling port city known as a relatively safe haven for fugitive slaves, where Frederick could find work using the corking skills he had learned in Baltimore. In New Bedford, Frederick and Anna began building a life. It was there that he took the name Douglass, chosen from a character in Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake, abandoning the surname Bailey, that connected him to his enslaved past. Frederick Douglass had been born not just as a name, but as a new identity, a free man who would speak for those still in chains. In New Bedford, Douglass encountered a thriving free black community and a strong abolitionist movement. He attended meetings of the Anti-Slavery Society and read William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, with intense interest. For the first time, he heard the institution of slavery denounced publicly and forcefully. The very things he had been thinking in secret spoken aloud by white and black activists who risked their safety to fight for justice. In August 1841, Douglass attended an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket. He went as an observer, not intending to speak, but William C. Coffin, who had heard Douglass speak at a black church gathering, urged him to share his story with the convention. Reluctantly, nervously, Douglass agreed. He rose to speak before the predominantly white audience, his hands trembling, his voice initially weak and uncertain. But as he began to tell his story, describing the separation from his mother, the brutality of plantation life, the whippings, the desperate hunger for freedom, something transformed. His voice grew stronger, his words more powerful. He spoke from the heart, from experience, with an authenticity that no theoretical abolitionist could match. The audience was mesmerized. Here was not just an abstract discussion of slavery's evils, but a living witness, a man who bore the scars and carried the memories of everything they discussed. William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous abolitionist in America, was present. After hearing Douglass speak, he rose to the platform and gave an impassioned speech, pointing to Douglass and shouting to the crowd, "Have you ever seen a slave? This is a slave. Will you allow him to be dragged back into bondage?" The audience responded with thunderous shouts of, "No, no, never!" The convention was electric with emotion and commitment. Douglass was immediately hired by the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as a lecturer. His job was to travel throughout the North, speaking at churches, town halls, and outdoor meetings, telling his story and arguing against slavery. It was dangerous work. Anti-abolitionist mobs frequently attacked speakers, and Douglass faced particular hostility as a black man who dared to speak publicly to white audiences. But he threw himself into the work with passionate commitment. For the next several years, he traveled constantly, sometimes delivering dozens of speeches per month. He developed into one of the most powerful orators in America, combining personal testimony with sophisticated philosophical and moral arguments. He could reduce audiences to tears with descriptions of slavery's cruelties, then elevate them with soaring rhetoric about human dignity and natural rights. His speeches were masterpieces of persuasion, combining emotional appeal with logical argumentation. But there was a problem that grew more acute as his fame increased. Many whites simply refused to believe he had been a slave. How could someone so articulate, so educated, so dignified in his bearing possibly have been property? His eloquence became evidence against him. People accused him of being a fraud, a free black man pretending to be a fugitive slave to advance the abolitionist cause. Some suggested he was too intelligent to have ever been enslaved, revealing the racist assumptions that even some abolitionists held about black people's capacities. To prove his authenticity and silence the doubters, Douglass made a decision that was both brave and extremely dangerous. In 1845, he published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. The book provided detailed, specific information about his life in slavery, names, places, dates, events that could be verified. It was written with literary power that rivaled any American autobiography of the era, demonstrating both his intellectual abilities and the truth of his experiences. The book was an immediate and phenomenal success, selling 5,000 copies in the first 4 months and eventually selling over 30,000 copies. It was translated into French and German. Douglass became internationally famous, but the book also revealed information that made him legally identifiable as the fugitive slave Frederick Bailey. His former owner, Thomas Old, now knew exactly where Frederick was and what he was doing. Under the fugitive slave law, Old had every legal right to have Douglass captured and forcibly returned to Maryland. Douglass had transformed himself legally into a marked man. Slave catchers now had specific information to hunt him. His public profile made him impossible to hide. Friends and advisors urged him to leave the country immediately before Old could organize his capture. In August 1845, just months after his book's publication, Douglass reluctantly boarded a ship bound for England. It wasn't a tour or an adventure. It was flight, escape from the land of his birth, because that land offered him no safety or legal protection. The voyage itself was revealing. When Douglass boarded the ship, he purchased a first-class cabin ticket, but the captain, under pressure from racist passengers, forced him to move to steerage with other people of color. Douglass protested publicly, and some passengers supported him, leading to heated arguments that nearly turned violent. It was his introduction to the fact that racism extended far beyond the slave South, that even in the North, even on an international vessel, his humanity was considered debatable. But the reception in England, Ireland, and Scotland was reveille and transformative. In Britain, Douglass experienced for the first time in his life what it felt like to be treated as a full human being regardless of his race. He was invited to speak to immense audiences in major cities. He dined with members of Parliament, prominent intellectuals, and social reformers. He stayed in hotels that would never have admitted him in America. He traveled in first-class railway carriages without incident. He was reviewed in major newspapers as a literary figure and moral voice, not as a curiosity or exotic specimen. The contrast was stunning and painful. In Britain, he was treated with respect and dignity. In America, he was legally property. In Britain, he could walk freely, eat where he chose, stay where he wished. In America, he would be hunted and captured. The experience forced him to confront the full extent of American racism and the possibility that genuine equality might never be achieved in his homeland. Douglass spoke throughout the British Isles for nearly 2 years, delivering hundreds of speeches to enthusiastic audiences. He was particularly moved by his reception in Ireland, where he saw parallels between British oppression of the Irish and American slavery, though he was also careful to note that Irish people, however oppressed, at least retained their legal humanity and family bonds in ways enslaved Americans did not. But even as he enjoyed his freedom and celebrity in Britain, Douglass was tormented by the irony. He was free abroad, but a prisoner if he returned home. He desperately wanted to return to America to continue the fight against slavery where it actually existed, to be reunited with his family. British friends and supporters organized a campaign to solve the problem legally. They raised $150, approximately $710, a substantial sum equivalent to roughly $25,000 in today's money, and negotiated with Thomas Al to purchase Douglass's freedom. Douglass was deeply conflicted about accepting this arrangement. On principle, it was repugnant. It meant acknowledging that he had been property, that one human could rightfully own another, that his freedom could be bought and sold like a commodity. Many abolitionists criticized the plan, arguing that it legitimized slavery. But pragmatically, Douglass recognized that refusing the offer meant permanent exile from America. After much agonizing, he accepted. On December 5, 1846, legal manumission papers were finalized. Frederick Douglass was officially legally free. In April 1847, he returned to the United States, no longer a fugitive but a free man with papers to prove it. British supporters had also raised funds to help him establish his own newspaper. Despite concerns from Garrison and other white abolitionists who thought Douglass should continue as a lecturer rather than compete with existing abolitionist publications, Douglass was determined to have his own platform, his own voice that he alone controlled. On December 3, 1847, in Rochester, New York, the first issue of the North Star was published. The name referenced the star that guided enslaved people fleeing north toward freedom. The masthead declared, "Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." Douglass served as editor and writer. While his family helped with printing and distribution for the next 13 years, the paper was later renamed Frederick Douglass's paper. He published weekly editorials, news articles, speeches, and reports about slavery and the fight for racial equality. The newspaper gave Douglass independence, but also brought enormous financial strain. Subscriptions barely covered costs, and Douglass poured his own money and lecture fees into keeping it afloat, but it also gave him something invaluable: control over his message and his image. The ability to engage in debates and controversies on his own terms, not as someone else's spokesperson. As his fame and influence grew, so did personal attacks and scandals. Douglass maintained close working relationships with several white women abolitionists, most notably Julia Griffiths and Artilly Asing. Julia Griffiths became his editorial assistant and financial manager for the North Star, helping stabilize the PAP's finances through her organizational skills and fundraising abilities. She was intelligent, dedicated, and completely committed to the abolitionist cause. She also lived for a time in Douglass's household, helping Anna manage the home while Frederick traveled. Odi Asing was a German Jewish journalist and intellectual who first interviewed Douglass in 1856 and became devoted to him and his cause. She translated his work into German, accompanied him on speaking tours, and spent summers at his home for over 2 decades. She was openly adoring of Douglass, seeing him as the embodiment of her ideals of human equality and dignity. Racist newspapers, particularly those opposed to abolition, seized on these relationships with vicious glee. They published crude caricatures showing Douglass with white women, with captions suggesting sexual impropriety. They accused him of adultery and of preferring white women to black women, of betraying his race by associating so closely with white women. The attacks were designed to discredit him morally and to see out division between him and other black leaders. The campaign was brutal and coordinated, appearing in newspapers across the country. Some articles suggested that Douglass's true motivation for fighting slavery was not justice but access to white women. Others painted him as a sexual predator or moral degenerate. The attacks were deeply painful and damaged his reputation, particularly in the black community, where some wondered whether the accusations had merit. Anna Douglass suffered these attacks largely in silence. She was a proud, private woman who had married Frederick when he was a fugitive with nothing, who had helped him escape, who had borne and raised 5 children largely alone while he traveled for months at a time. She was illiterate despite Frederick's attempts to teach her and deeply uncomfortable with public life. The household was her domain, and she ran it with competence and strength. But she was also aware of the rumors, aware of the close relationships her husband maintained with educated white women whose company he clearly enjoyed in ways he couldn't share with her. Douglass never publicly addressed the specific allegations. He refused to justify or explain his friendships, maintaining that his private life was not subject to public inquisition. He never confirmed or denied romantic involvement beyond his marriage, maintaining strategic silence that infuriated his accusers and left the truth ambiguous. His position was principled that interracial friendship and collaboration were essential to the abolitionist cause, and that accusations of impropriety were themselves rooted in racist assumptions about black men and white women. But the silence came at a cost. The scandal persisted for years, used as a weapon against him in political debates and personal attacks. It created tension in his marriage and distance from some black leaders who felt he was reinforcing racist stereotypes. Whether there was actual infidelity or simply intense but platonic friendships, Douglass believed that the accusations themselves were more revealing about American racism than about his personal conduct. In 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown secretly approached Douglass with an audacious and desperate plan. Brown had already earned a violent reputation from his actions in Bleeding, Kansas, where he had led attacks against pro-slavery settlers. Now he proposed something far more dramatic. He would raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, seize the weapons stored there, arm enslaved people in the surrounding region, and trigger a massive slave insurrection that would spread throughout the South and destroy slavery by force. Brown desperately wanted Douglass as an ally and co-conspirator. He believed that Douglass's name and reputation would inspire enslaved people to join the uprising, and that Douglass's intelligence would be invaluable in planning and executing the revolt. He arranged a secret meeting in an abandoned stone quarry near Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. There, with only Brown's young associate John Carey present, Brown laid out his plan. For hours, Brown argued with passionate intensity. He believed that slavery was such a monstrous evil that violence was not only justified, but morally required. He insisted that enslaved people were ready to rise up, that they merely needed weapons and leadership. He argued that Frederick, as a former slave who understood the system from within, was essential to the success of the plan. He appealed to their shared hatred of slavery and shared commitment to freedom. Douglass listened carefully, asked questions, considered the plan from every angle, and ultimately refused to participate. His reasons were both tactical and strategic. He believed Brown's plan was suicidal, that it would fail militarily and result in the massacre of everyone involved. He argued that attacking a federal arsenal would be seen not as an attack on slavery, but as treason and insurrection against the United States government, turning public opinion against abolitionists. He warned that even if some enslaved people initially joined the uprising, they would be hunted down and slaughtered by military forces. He predicted that the raid would strengthen pro-slavery forces by confirming their fears of slave rebellions and justifying increased repression. Brown pleaded with him to reconsider. "Come with me, Douglass. I will defend you with my life. I want you for a special purpose. When I strike, the bees will begin to swarm, and I shall want you to help hive them." But Douglass remained firm. "You're walking into a perfect steel trap, and you will never get out alive." In October 1859, Brown executed his plan with a small group of followers, including several of his own sons. They successfully captured the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, but no mass slave uprising occurred. Instead, they were quickly surrounded by local militia and then by United States Marines commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee. In the assault that retook the arsenal, 10 of Brown's men were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown himself was captured, tried for treason, and hanged on December 2, 1859. The raid sent shockwaves through the nation. The South erupted in hysteria about slave insurrections with increased patrols, restrictions on enslaved and free blacks, and paranoid searches for conspirators. The North was divided between those who saw Brown as a martyr for freedom and those who condemned him as a terrorist and madman. Ralph Waldo Emerson called Brown a saint whose execution would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. Others saw him as a dangerous fanatic whose actions pushed the nation toward civil war. Douglass was immediately implicated. When Brown was captured, authorities found letters from Douglass among his possessions. Virginia Governor Henry Wise demanded Douglass's arrest and extradition to Virginia to stand trial as a co-conspirator in Brown's treason. Federal warrants were issued. Douglass was speaking in Philadelphia when he received warning that he was about to be arrested. He immediately fled, first to New York, then to Canada, and eventually back to England to avoid extradition. From abroad, Douglass defended Brown's intentions while maintaining that he had been right to refuse participation. He wrote, "John Brown has initiated a new mode of carrying on the crusade of freedom, and his blow has sent dread and terror throughout the entire ranks of the piratical army of slavery." But he also confirmed that he had declined to join the raid, believing it strategically doomed. This refusal would haunt Douglass. Radical abolitionists, particularly those who revered Brown as a martyr, accused Douglass of cowardice. They suggested he had abandoned Brown to save his own skin, that he had refused the call to action when the moment for courage arrived. The accusations stung because they struck at Douglass's sense of himself as a fighter for freedom. He responded publicly and privately that joining Brown would have accomplished nothing except adding his name to the list of the dead. That strategic wisdom was not the same as cowardice, that he could do more good alive than dead. But the moral weight of the accusation remained. Years later, after the Civil War, Douglass would write, "I have little inclination to debate the question as to who is the great man. I will say, however, that I have seen many of the leaders who, in my judgment, measure higher than John Brown. He has been greatly exaggerated, but he is undoubtedly a remarkable man." It was a defensive statement, revealing ongoing sensitivity about his decision. When the Civil War finally erupted in April 1861, Douglass saw it as the moment he had been preparing for all his adult life. Here finally was the crisis that would determine whether America would remain a slave nation or become a free one. From the very first days of the war, Douglass used every platform available to him to argue that this must become a war to end slavery, not merely a war to preserve the Union. Initially, President Lincoln and most Northern politicians insisted the war was only about keeping the Union together, not about abolishing slavery. Lincoln worried that making emancipation a war aim would drive the border slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, into the Confederacy. But Douglass argued passionately and publicly that the Union could never truly win without destroying the institution that had caused the conflict, that slavery and democracy could not coexist, that a restored Union with slavery intact would simply lead to future conflicts. Through his newspaper speeches and writings, Douglass hammered this message relentlessly. This is no time to fight only with your soft white hand and allow your black hand to remain tied. Give the black man a chance. Give him a chance to show his humanity and his devotion. He argued that enslaved people themselves should be armed and allowed to fight for their freedom. That black men had every right to participate in the struggle to determine their own fate. For nearly 2 years, Lincoln resisted these arguments. But the pressure from Douglass and other abolitionists, combined with military necessity as the war dragged on, gradually shifted Lincoln's position. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be forever free. It was a limited measure. It didn't free enslaved people in border states or areas under Union control, but it fundamentally transformed the character of the war. Douglass immediately recognized both the proclamation's importance and its limitations. He celebrated it as a crucial step while pushing for complete abolition. And he threw himself into a new effort, recruiting black soldiers to fight for the Union. He traveled extensively, speaking to black communities, urging men to enlist. 2 of his own sons, Lewis and Charles, were among the first to join the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official black units in the Union Army. Douglass promised these recruits that they would fight as equals, that their service would prove black men's courage and capability, that their participation would earn black people full citizenship rights after the war. He recruited with passionate eloquence. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pockets, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States. But the promises were immediately broken. Black soldiers were paid $10 per month compared to $13 for white soldiers. They were commanded almost exclusively by white officers. They received inferior equipment and medical care. They were assigned primarily to labor rather than combat duty. And when they were captured by Confederate forces, they faced execution or sale into slavery rather than treatment as prisoners of war under the laws of war. Douglass was furious at this betrayal. He felt personally responsible for having recruited men under false pretenses. He temporarily stopped his recruiting efforts and demanded a meeting with President Lincoln to address these injustices. In August 1863, he traveled to Washington, D.C., and after a brief wait was ushered into Lincoln's office at the White House. It was a historic meeting, one of the first times a president formally received a black leader. Lincoln greeted Douglass respectfully, calling him Mr. Douglass, and listening carefully to his complaints and demands. Douglass insisted on equal pay for black soldiers, equal treatment, protection for black prisoners of war. Lincoln listened, explained his political constraints, made vague promises about future improvements. He treated Douglass with courtesy but offered little concrete action. Douglass left disappointed but not completely disillusioned. He recognized Lincoln's political skill and genuine movement toward justice, even if painfully slow. He resumed recruiting, arguing that despite the injustices, black men needed to fight for their own freedom, that their military service would establish their claim to citizenship in ways nothing else could. The Civil War ended in April 1865 with Confederate surrender. On December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, officially abolishing slavery throughout the United States. Douglass was 47 years old and had devoted every adult day of his life to this moment. It should have been pure triumph. Instead, the victory was bittersweet and incomplete. The legal end of slavery did not mean the end of racism or the beginning of equality. Almost immediately, Southern states began implementing black codes, laws designed to restrict the freedom of formerly enslaved people, forcing them into labor contracts barely distinguishable from slavery, criminalizing unemployment, restricting movement and property rights. Violence against black people exploded. The Ku Klux Klan emerged, conducting campaigns of terror, whippings, and murder to maintain white supremacy through intimidation. Douglass traveled through the South in 1866 and was horrified by what he found. In many areas, freed people remained on the same plantations, working for the same masters under exploitative contracts. They had legal freedom, but no land, no education, no economic independence, no political power. They faced violence if they demanded fair wages or tried to leave. White Southerners were systematically rebuilding slavery in everything but name. The North, meanwhile, was rapidly losing interest in the plight of freed people. Many Northern whites felt that ending slavery had fulfilled the nation's moral obligation, and they wanted to return to normal life and business. The radical Republicans who pushed for genuine racial equality were a minority even within their own party. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded the assassinated Lincoln, actively opposed strong measures to protect freed people or punish former Confederates. Douglass threw himself into the fight for Reconstruction, arguing for voting rights, land redistribution, education, and federal protection for freed people. He supported the 14th Amendment granting citizenship to formerly enslaved people, and the 15th Amendment prohibiting voting discrimination based on race. He gave hundreds of speeches demanding that the revolution begun by the war be completed through genuine social transformation. But he also faced bitter conflicts with former allies. The women's suffrage movement split over the 15th Amendment. Leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed it because it granted voting rights to black men but not to women of any race. They argued that educated white women deserved the vote before illiterate black men. Some used openly racist rhetoric warning of the dangers of ignorant black male voters. Douglass was torn. He had long supported women's suffrage and had been one of the few men to attend the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. But he argued that black men faced immediate threats of violence and needed political power urgently for basic survival, while white women, however politically disadvantaged, at least had the protection of their race. He favored a strategic approach: secure black male suffrage now, then continue fighting for women's voting rights. This position damaged his relationships with some suffragist leaders, though he maintained friendships and alliances with many. He also faced criticism from more radical black leaders who felt he was too accommodating to white power, too willing to work within a system that was fundamentally racist. Douglass believed in working through political channels, persuasion, and reform. Others increasingly argued for more militant resistance or even separation from white society. The debates revealed different assessments of how much progress was possible within American democracy. Anna Murray Douglass died in August 1882 at 69 years old. She had been Frederick's wife for 44 years since the desperate days when he was a fugitive, and she was a free woman willing to risk everything to help him escape. She had borne 5 children, raised them largely alone while Frederick traveled for months at a time. She had managed households, endured poverty in their early years, and later prosperity. She had lived through the scandals about her husband's relationships with other women. She had been the anchor, the stable center, while Frederick became a public figure. Frederick was genuinely grief-stricken by her death. He had depended on Anna in ways he rarely acknowledged publicly. She had created the home that he returned to, had provided the emotional stability that allowed him to take risks. Their relationship had been complicated. They were very different people who lived increasingly separate lives. But it had also been real and important. But after a period of mourning, Frederick also felt something like liberation. Anna had represented his past, the world of his early struggles. With her death, he was free to fully embrace a different kind of life. And 18 months later, in January 1884, he shocked the nation by marrying Helen Pitts. Helen was 46 years old to Douglass's 66. More significantly, she was white from an abolitionist family in upstate New York. She was college-educated, a feminist activist, a suffragist, and a writer. She had worked as Douglass's secretary and clearly shared his intellectual and political interests in ways Anna never had. The reaction was explosive and vitriolic. Racist whites attacked with predictable fury, seeing the marriage as the ultimate violation of racial boundaries, proof of everything they had feared about racial equality leading to race mixing. Newspapers published vicious cartoons and editorials. Death threats poured in. Douglass was burned in effigy in some southern towns. But what hurt Douglass more was the reaction from much of the black community. He was accused of betraying black women, of considering them inferior, of having sold out to whiteness at the first opportunity. His own children, particularly his daughter Rosetta, were deeply hurt and angry. They felt he had dishonored their mother's memory by so quickly marrying a white woman. Family relationships ruptured with some of his children refusing to speak to him or visit his home. Douglass responded to the controversy with a characteristically bold and provocative statement. "This proves I am impartial. My first wife was the color of my mother, and the second the color of my father." It was witty and defiant, but also deliberately inflammatory. He was pointing out the hypocrisy of a society that condemned his interracial marriage, while his very existence was the result of a white man's sexual violence against his enslaved mother. If his mixed-race heritage was acceptable, why wasn't his interracial marriage? He refused to apologize or justify his choice. In speeches and writings, he argued that genuine racial equality required breaking down barriers of all kinds, including those against interracial marriage. He said that love and companionship should transcend race, that condemning interracial relationships was itself a form of racism. He maintained that those who truly believed in racial equality should celebrate rather than condemn his marriage. Helen proved to be an ideal partner for this stage of his life. She shared his intellectual interests, edited his speeches and writings, accompanied him on travels, engaged in political discussions as an equal. In 1886, 1887, they traveled together to England, France, Italy, Egypt, and Greece, a grand tour of the kind that only wealthy white Americans typically undertook. Douglass, born a slave, now toured the ancient monuments of civilization as a distinguished statesman and scholar, accompanied by his white wife, defying every assumption about race and status. But the marriage also meant permanent estrangement from some of his children and portions of the black community. It was a price Douglass was willing to pay, but it was a real loss nonetheless. He maintained his principles even when they cost him personally, refusing to bow to social pressure or convention. During his final decades, Douglass held several prestigious government appointments. In 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes appointed him U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, the first black person to hold this position. Clears throat. In 1881, President James Garfield appointed him Recorder of Deeds for Washington, D.C. From 1889 to 1891, President Benjamin Harrison appointed him U.S. Minister and Consul General to Haiti. These positions should have represented the fulfillment of his life's work, proof that a man born a slave could rise to positions of honor and authority in the American government. But each appointment came with indignities and disappointments that revealed how incomplete racial progress remained. As U.S. Marshal, Douglass was responsible for introducing guests at presidential receptions and official functions. But President Hayes, worried about Southern white reaction, asked Douglass to skip the most high-profile events. Douglass was given the title but prevented from fully performing the ceremonial duties. He resigned in frustration after 2 years. His appointment to Haiti was even more problematic. Douglass was tasked with negotiating for a U.S. naval base at Mont Saint-Nicolas, but he was undermined by other American officials who treated him with contempt because of his race and who negotiated behind his back. When the negotiations failed, he was blamed. Though he argued convincingly that he had been set up to fail by racist officials who never wanted a black diplomat to succeed. Throughout these years, he also witnessed the systematic destruction of Reconstruction's gains. In 1877, the Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction in exchange for resolving the disputed 1876 election. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Southern states immediately moved to disenfranchise black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, property requirements, and outright violence and intimidation. The Supreme Court struck down civil rights protections, ruling in case after case that the federal government had limited power to protect black people against discrimination. Lynching became epidemic in the South, with black men and sometimes women murdered by mobs for alleged crimes or simply for uppity behavior. These lynchings were often public spectacles advertised in advance, attended by thousands of white spectators, including families with children. Victims were tortured, mutilated, and burned. Body parts were taken as souvenirs and perpetrators were never prosecuted. Douglass spoke out repeatedly against lynching, calling it murder most foul and horrible and demanding federal intervention. But his protests went largely unheeded. The North had lost interest in protecting black Southerners. The South reasserted white supremacy with increasing confidence. The promise of equality was dying. In his final years, Douglass's speeches took on a tone of warning and urgency. He could see that America was betraying the principles he had fought for, that the nation was choosing racial oppression over justice. In an 1883 speech after the Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, he declared, "We have been grievously wounded in the house of our friends. The Supreme Court has surrendered. It has surrendered our rights to the states, and the states have surrendered them to the mob." He warned that racial injustice would poison American democracy for generations, that the country could never be truly free while any of its people remained oppressed. He spoke with the passion of someone who had dedicated his entire life to a cause and could see that cause being betrayed. But he also maintained hope, arguing that the moral arc of history bent toward justice, even if the pace was painfully slow. On February 20th, 1895, Frederick Douglass woke in his home at Cedar Hill in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C. He was 77 years old and his health had been declining, but on this day he felt energized and engaged. He attended the National Council of Women Convention in Washington. It was fitting that his final public appearance would be at a women's rights meeting, given his lifelong support for women's suffrage. When he entered the hall, the entire audience rose and applauded. Susan B. Anthony, his old friend, despite their disagreements over strategy, greeted him warmly. He sat in the front row, engaged and attentive, occasionally nodding or smiling at particular points. After the convention, he returned home to Cedar Hill in good spirits. During dinner with Helen, he enthusiastically recounted the events of the day. He was animated, gesturing as he described the speeches, imitating different speakers, laughing at particular moments. Helen was delighted to see him so engaged and happy. Suddenly, in the middle of a sentence describing one speaker's argument, his expression changed. He clasped his hands to his chest. His face registered confusion and then pain. He tried to speak but couldn't form words. He started to stand, then collapsed to his knees. Helen rushed to him, calling his name, trying to support him as he fell, but he was already gone, or nearly so. Massive heart attack. Within minutes, Frederick Douglass was dead, dying in mid-sentence, in mid-thought, still engaged with the world until the very last moment. The news spread rapidly. The funeral was held at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, with thousands in attendance and thousands more unable to fit inside. Tributes poured in from across the country and around the world. Prominent politicians, activists, intellectuals, and ordinary people who had been inspired by his words and example mourned his passing, but the nation was deeply divided in how it remembered him. For Black Americans and progressive whites, he was a hero without equal, a man who had risen from slavery to become one of the greatest Americans of any era. His life was proof of Black people's capabilities and humanity, a rebuke to every racist assumption. For white supremacists and those who opposed racial equality, his death was barely noted or was even quietly celebrated, and for many white Americans, he was a figure from a past they wanted to forget, a reminder of conflicts they preferred to consider resolved. Frederick Douglass died without seeing the racial justice he had dedicated his entire life to achieving. He lived to see slavery legally abolished, but not white supremacy culturally destroyed. He saw Black people gain legal freedom, but not genuine equality, civil rights on paper, but not in practice. His somber predictions about America's racial future proved devastatingly accurate. The decades after his death brought intensified segregation, systematic disenfranchisement, economic exploitation, and terroristic violence against Black Americans. The promise of Reconstruction was fully betrayed. The 20th century would bring the full apparatus of Jim Crow segregation, which wouldn't begin to be dismantled until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, 60 to 70 years after Douglass's death. In 1963, exactly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and 68 years after Douglass's death, Martin Luther King Jr. would stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., just a few miles from where Douglass spent his final years, and deliver his "I Have a Dream" speech. King's speech echoed themes Douglass had articulated a century earlier: that America had failed to fulfill its promises to black citizens, that racial justice was a moral imperative, that the nation could never be truly free while any of its people remained oppressed. Douglass's legacy is complex and multifaceted. As a writer, he produced some of the most powerful prose of the 19th century prose that combined literary elegance with moral clarity and emotional power. His three autobiographies, the 1845 narrative, the 1855 My Bondage and My Freedom, and the 1881 Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, are classics of American literature, essential texts for understanding slavery, freedom, and American democracy. As an orator, he was perhaps unequaled in American history, combining passionate delivery with sophisticated argumentation, emotional appeal with logical rigor. He could speak for hours, holding audiences mesmerized, moving them from tears to laughter to righteous anger. His speeches were carefully crafted works of rhetoric that repay close study. As an activist and political thinker, he developed a sophisticated philosophy of social change that combined moral persuasion, political engagement, and unwavering insistence on fundamental principles. He understood that changing society required changing hearts and minds, passing laws and enforcing them, building coalitions, and maintaining principles. He was pragmatic without being unprincipled, willing to compromise on tactics while refusing to compromise on ultimate goals. As a human being, he was complicated and imperfect. His relationships were sometimes troubled. He could be stubborn and proud. He was capable of causing pain to people who loved him. His personal life was messy in ways that complicated his public image. He was not a saint, but a man. Brilliant, courageous, flawed, human. But above all, Frederick Douglass proved something fundamentally important: that human beings cannot be permanently reduced to property. That intelligence and dignity cannot be bred out or beaten out of people. That one person with courage and eloquence can change the terms of public debate and move the arc of history. He proved that a man born as cattle could become a moral giant, that someone denied education could become one of his era's greatest intellectuals, that the son of a slave woman could stand as an equal with presidents and prime ministers. He demonstrated that freedom is not a gift, but a conquest. That justice is not inevitable, but must be fought for in every generation. That progress is not linear, but requires constant vigilance and renewed commitment. His most famous words remain a challenge and an inspiration: if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, the property of another human being, a thing to be bought and sold. He died Frederick Douglass, legally free, internationally famous, one of the most important Americans of the 19th century. The distance he traveled from slave cabin to the White House, from illiteracy to literary greatness, from powerlessness to moral authority was vast, almost beyond comprehension. His life proved that even in the deepest darkness of injustice and oppression, the human spirit cannot be completely extinguished. That even when systems of power try to reduce people to things, humanity persists. That words and ideas can be more powerful than whips and chains. That one person armed with courage and eloquence and an unwavering commitment to justice can change the world. The America that Frederick Douglass helped build remains unfinished. The struggle he waged continues in different forms, but every barrier broken, every right secured, every voice raised against injustice is part of his legacy. He taught us that freedom is a verb, not a noun, something you do, not something you have. He showed us that dignity cannot be granted or taken away, but can only be claimed and defended. He demonstrated that the fight for justice is the work of every generation, requiring courage, persistence, and faith that right will ultimately prevail, even when progress seems impossibly slow. And that perhaps is Frederick Douglass's most enduring lesson, that the struggle for human dignity is never finally won, but must be taken up anew by each generation. That setbacks are inevitable, but surrender is unacceptable. That hope is not a prediction, but a choice we make every